every portrait is a lesson in how to compose a face and how to make the face alive and exciting. Shall we talk about portraiture for a minute?
We can. When you talk about portraiture, I think portraiture is something that can really range from commercial, very, very commercial, and to very, very fine art, and that there's a mixing between those two extremes. How do you use the portrait as a means of expression?
A means of expression would be, for me, when I pick someone to photograph, and I'm doing it for the love of it only. In other words, I'm not doing it because the client has come to me and asked me to take a portrait for them to put on the web or to sell themselves. Sometimes I might be doing a family portrait or just a person for their own life. That's, of course, a wonderful thing. When I'm actually photographing, it's completely in the moment, and I don't even think about the fact I'm working as a business or personal. So that, because the act of photography is so, it's so much of a meditation on itself.
So that line blurs between the commercial and the fine art in the moment,
yep.
And yet you are really clear that sometimes you're working as a commercial photographer, and
yes.
Sometimes you're doing projects that are for your own creativity.
Yes, yes, indeed. So, for example, say I've found somebody who's really just has a wonderful head or whatever, and I might be photographing them just because I want to take that photograph. And so that would be probably, for me right now, still, it would be on negatives. It would be with my Hasselblad square format. And it would be because my fine art work has largely come out of many years of photographing with negatives. And a lot of my work, even though I do a lot of color, in portraiture, there's something magical about doing a portrait that's only in black and white. For one thing, it reduces it to a composition that's very abstract. And then in that way, you can focus on the personality with no distractions. And then the picture itself can be beautifully toned and made into something that's magical. Mm-hmm. That came to a head for me in 2005 when I did a book that had been the result of 8 years of portraits of poets. And that was a wonderful project that put together 6 portraits a year, really, of poets who came to the University of California to read their poems. And they were offered a portrait, and then they came to me, and I did a studio portrait, lighting, studio lighting, because I didn't know if they would be coming in the daytime, in the evening, on a rainy day, what it would be. So I wanted a consistent graphic look. Mm-hmm. So if you want to put it that way, it was a series that I kind of planned out ahead of time mentally. But when I came to each person, of course, it was all about how did that person really look like a poet. I was interested in graphically conveying what I saw them do when they read their poetry. The poetry as an oral tradition, kind of like a more, using their hands sometimes as an expressive device. It was really an exciting project.
So that would be the face of poetry.
The face of poetry it was UC Press that published it eventually in 2005. Very difficult to get your portrait work in a book, unless they're famous people or celebrities.
Which are relatively famous, but maybe not. And no, and that's sort of the overall concept of that book. If I'm correct, you have the portraits, you have the poems, and then you actually had a CD, the readings of the poetry.
Right.
And the total package really helped have it relive the experience that you had of hearing the poet and then visiting with them and photographing.
Right. And that was a culmination for me of portraiture that's both for myself and also for clients. So it kind of married the two sides of portraiture for me. And it was a very exciting process because these are creative people. Poets are very expressive and creative. And when they loved their portrait, you know, I was thrilled. And those pictures went on, many of them, to be used in their other books, other ways, and that was always a wonderful experience that came out of doing that book. But that's, unless you photograph famous people, really famous people. Now, poets are famous in their world, just the way composers are famous in their world, and, you know, entertainers are famous in their world. The photographer often gets associated with the person they're photographing. I'm not particularly interested in famous people. I like people. I like ordinary people. I like people who have expressive personalities in themselves. My whole work, the work of portraiture, is highly theatrical. You're really a director, and you're a shaman in a way. You're reading that person, and you're letting them express themselves through their face. Mm-hmm. Now, maybe it's also through all of their body, a different kind of portrait. But if we just focus on the idea of the face, you've got light and shadow, you have flat lighting that's not dramatic, you have dramatic lighting coming from the side, and so forth and so forth. So you have to make 1,000 decisions that are photographic with light and shadow, and then you also have the message of the person, and the person has to come out, and you have to coax them out. My favorite analogy is, if you want to know how to lose a person into their head, just think about the groom on a wedding day. Often, the groom in the picture is so overwhelmed by all of this feminine energy that he is completely blank. His eyes are dead. Mm-hmm. He has gone somewhere in his head or somewhere else, and I have to snap my fingers and wake him up. So often I'm monitoring that because there's a fear factor in portraiture. Yeah. And so I want to get the person to come on out.
So do you have a story from the face of poetry that has an interesting photographic element, or was a really interesting connection or life experience for you?
The most important poet in the whole group was Milosz, the Polish poet who was at Cal, a professor here for many years, in exile from Poland. And then he spent his last some years going back and forth between Berkeley and Poland, Warsaw. And he was 90 when he read, and there was quite a lot of press that came to the reading. It was very well attended and very exciting, and he was this monumental man, really. So when he came to do the portrait, his wife came with him. She was much younger, and she said, well, his hearing aids were not working, so she would whisper in his ear every time I said something to him. So she did that, and I said, well, Mr. Milosz, when I saw you reading, I envisioned you as a mountain of granite. And there was this silence, and then he said, with a twinkle in his eye, well, if I am granite, my wife is a diamond. You know, he liked women. So it was very exciting, and then he went on with, you know, beyond granite and diamonds to other things. But the point is that he gave me his twinkle. And a lot of portraits of him, pictures of him, were not twinkly.
No.
He was a very powerful man in many ways, and an incredible poet. I mean, his poetry is deep. Anyway, his portrait was perfect for him because he was absolutely straight on, holding onto his cane. He was very nattily dressed, and he gave me, you know, a man who was strong, but who also
enjoyed having a little secret.
So the opposite of that would be Billy Collins. And Billy Collins, as you know, his poetry is light, but it's not lightweight. It's charming, and it captures you, and then it stays with you, and you enjoy every word. He wants to please people, so I guess I identified with him a lot. He wasn't telling a very dark story, which of course Milosz had to tell. So Billy Collins was an utter delight to photograph, and he was available, he was accessible, he was exactly the way his poems are, and he's the only one of the poets at the end of the session. He whipped out his little tiny camera out of his pocket and took a picture of me. I mean, it was so utterly charming and delightful and completely spontaneous. So that was, Billy Collins was a trip, and I enjoyed it. With portraiture, of course, one tends to talk about the anecdotes of the people you're photographing, or the war stories about, some difficult person or something like that. So we forget to talk about the actual process of making that head look good. And one thing that some people have difficult faces. One of the poets in the book, who was a charming woman and utterly delightful, and I won't tell you her name because the story is a little bit tricky. She wouldn't mind really, but anyway, she was very witty, very funny, but she told me, I have never had a good photograph taken of me because I just have a terrible face. Well, I can tell you what the problem was. Think of the Wicked Witch of the West. Long nose, big chin coming out. So if the nose gets too close to the mouth and the chin, you've got that look of, we all know, the Wicked Witch of the West. So what do? Also, she wore glasses, and we all know that glasses reflect light, even if they've got wonderful film on them. So I have to turn her head away from the light, right? And then I have to figure out, how do I get her to look like the delightful, witty, really brilliant person that she is without, having that chin and that nose. So I turned her away from the light, and I turned her head down to minimize the chin and the nose, okay? And then I grabbed her attention with her eyes, and she whipped her eyes up to me with a twinkle. And so I had it, because her nose was not competing with her eyes. And her glasses were fine. And they didn't matter to the picture at all, because she was kind of peeking over them. Anyway, she loved the picture. I felt, complete triumph. So that's the kind of compositional issue. There's so many of these very tricky little compositional issues that I've learned in teaching portraiture that they just stop people in their tracks. They just are so overwhelmed by having a person in front of them.
Right.
And then what do they do, and how do they talk, and then how do they compose while they're talking? Are they meant to entertain the person? What are they meant to do? So, as you know, when you're out there with a landscape, you've got to have your craft right there in your camera for when that moment arrives. And the same thing's true with people.
Right. Give us a picture of your process in making a portrait. How do you approach the portrait setting?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I have to allow the person to be completely him or herself, or their selves. And I have to watch and wait. I don't tell them what to do. And then I see what their gestures are. I see how they move. I see what their energy is. And then I try to get in the dance, flow in that energy. Now, first of all, of course, I have got to put them in the right light. Whether I'm in natural light or studio light, I have to have the light that's appropriate for that person, whether it's an old person, a child, whoever it is. And then, so that's a given. And it's learn your technique, have your technique, and then forget it. Because you can't be only taking a technical picture of a person. It has to transcend the technique. So I'm trying to almost meditate on the person in an active way. I'm connecting, and that is a dance. Moving with the person, allowing the person to connect with me, and then suddenly there's a way they are, and I get it, and boom, snap the shutter. And then I'm working from then on to get them to that place where they are their best self. Now, with a grown-up, I can start doing a little directing because I see that they have one side of their face that really expresses themselves in a more, they always move their head, say, to one side. That's what they always do. So I'm saying, oh, yeah, well, and then I might start a dialogue about that and end with that being the picture where they really look like themselves. It's a really individual kind of situation. It's almost 80% therapy at that point. It's very psychological. But it's also a little bit beyond that. I'm really moving into their space, and then I'm allowing them to be important, and I'm disappearing. It's really hard to describe. Now, if we're talking about a different age group, if we're with children, as you know, they are so immediate and they are so in the moment that you have a completely different experience because you have to keep up with them. Mm-hmm. And you have to stop their motion because they're always in motion, or you have to engage their imagination. So if I have a wrangler, in other words, the mother or an assistant or both, then I'm trying to work very hard to have them just be happy in the moment, and they forget that they're being photographed and they're in a little theater of their own. And then it's just shooting it and taking off with it. It's really fun. It's also strangely easy to photograph children and strangely difficult, because they're so easy because children are so adorable. It's difficult because you want to get through the adorableness and also through the smiles that they put on for their families, the sort of canned look, to something more authentic. And that's where the difficulty comes, of moving past the typical picture.